After years of saving, I finally paid off my condo. Then my sister arrived with her bags, saying it should be her delayed wedding gift. Have you ever faced a betrayal so deep, so calculated, that it ripped through your sense of family and left you stunned? What if someone you loved, someone who was family, looked you in the eye and tried to take everything you'd worked for with absolute entitlement? And what if, in a moment of pure desperation, I whispered one thing that made her entire world snap? My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how my sister-in-law, Jessica, tried to steal our home, shatter our marriage, and then faced the most spectacular comeuppance I've ever witnessed. Jessica, she's 35, Mike's older sister, and she's always had this bizarre sense of entitlement when it comes to anything her family owns. She's married to Brad, and they have 2 kids, Emma and Jake, who are 8 and 9. 3 years ago, Mike and I finally bought our first home. We'd been renting a small apartment, scraping every penny together for a down payment. We found this beautiful 2-bedroom condo in a great neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. The mortgage was hefty, but we managed it by living frugally, pouring every extra dollar toward the principal. Jessica, she was less than thrilled. At the family barbecue where we announced it, she made these snide comments about how some people get all the luck and how she and Brad could never afford something like that, despite both having decent jobs. Her passive-aggressive comments stung, but Mike just brushed them off as typical Jessica behavior. What I didn't know then was that Jessica had developed this twisted belief that anything Mike owned was somehow partially hers too. See, when their parents died 5 years ago, they'd left the family house to both Mike and Jessica equally. Jessica had bought out Mike's half using her inheritance money, which she constantly reminded everyone about. According to her twisted logic, this meant she was entitled to any property Mike acquired afterward. Fast forward 3 years. Mike and I had been aggressive about paying down our mortgage. We cut out dining out, canceled subscriptions, took on side gigs, and threw every bonus and tax refund at the principal. It was exhausting, but we were determined to be debt-free before we turned 35. During this time, Jessica's financial situation took a nosedive. Brad lost his job in a corporate restructuring, and they'd already been living paycheck to paycheck even when he was employed. They'd burned through their savings and were struggling to make rent on their 3-bedroom apartment. Instead of downsizing or making tough financial decisions, Jessica seemed to think the universe owed her a solution. Her entitled behavior escalated gradually. First, it was just jokes about how Mike and I were hogging all the good luck. Then came suggestions that we should help family out by letting them stay with us temporarily. When we explained that our condo only had 2 bedrooms and we used the second as a home office, she'd roll her eyes and mutter about how we were being selfish. The breaking point came last month. Mike and I had just made our final mortgage payment. We were over the moon, completely debt-free at 35 and 32, respectively. We decided to throw a small celebration dinner and invited both sides of the family. I'll never forget the moment I announced that we'd paid off the condo. Everyone was congratulating us, except Jessica. She sat there with this weird, calculating expression on her face. After dinner, as people were starting to leave, she cornered me in the kitchen. "So," she said, loading the word with false casualness, "now that the condo's paid off, it's basically a family asset, right?" I blinked at her. "I'm sorry, what?" "Well, you used family money to help pay for it, didn't you?" She was referring to the $5,000 Mike's grandmother had given us as a wedding gift that we put toward our down payment years earlier. "Jessica," I said, "that was a gift specifically to Mike and me for our wedding. It's not family money." She waved her hand dismissively. "Family money is family money. And since you don't really need all this space, Brad and I have been talking, and we think it makes sense for us to move in. You can find somewhere smaller." I stared at her, certain I'd misheard. "You want us to move out of our home so you can move in?" "It's not just your home, though, is it? It's a family asset. Mike inherited that house with me, and now you too have this place. It's time to share the wealth." Her tone was matter-of-fact, like she was discussing the weather. "Jessica, we bought this condo. We've spent 3 years paying for it. It's in our names. But you wouldn't have been able to buy it without family help," she insisted. "That $5,000 was the deal breaker, and that came from our family. Plus, Mike's always been a golden child. Mom and Dad helped him through college while I had to take out loans." This was completely false. Mike had worked 2 jobs through college and graduated with debt, just like Jessica. But I could see there was no reasoning with her. "We're not moving out of our home, Jessica." Her mask of false reason slipped. "Well, maybe you should think about what's best for the family. Brad's been out of work for months, and Emma needs stability. You two are being incredibly selfish." Before I could respond, Mike walked into the kitchen. "Hey, what's going on?" Jessica immediately switched tactics, putting on her wounded victim voice. "I was just explaining to Sarah how much we could use some family support right now. I thought maybe you'd understand, being my brother and all." Mike looked confused. "What kind of support?" "She wants us to move out so they can live here," I said flatly. Mike's jaw dropped. "What? Jessica, are you serious?" "Oh, come on, Mike. You know, I helped raise you after Dad left the first time. Family takes care of family." "Dad never left," Mike said, his voice tight. "And you were 17 when I was born, Jessica. You didn't raise me." The argument that followed was ugly. Jessica accused Mike of abandoning his family, brought up every favor she'd ever done for him, real or imagined, and finally stormed out with Brad and the kids in tow. But not before announcing that she'd be back the next week to work out the details of them moving in. After they left, Mike was a wreck. Despite Jessica's behavior, he loved his sister and hated family conflict. He actually started wondering if we should consider letting them stay temporarily, maybe converting the home office back to a bedroom. That night, as Mike paced around our living room, I watched him spiral into guilt and self-doubt. This was Jessica's specialty, making people question their own reasonable boundaries by weaponizing family loyalty. "Maybe she has a point," Mike said for the 3rd time. "I mean, we do have more space than we need. And Emma and Jake didn't ask for any of this." I sat down my tea and looked at him seriously. "Mike, do you remember what happened when Jessica lived with your parents during her divorce from her first husband?" Mike paused his pacing. "That was different. She was only supposed to stay for a month. She stayed for 8 months. Your parents couldn't get her to leave, and she didn't pay a dime in rent or utilities. Your mom told me she almost had a nervous breakdown dealing with Jessica's drama and mess." "But this situation is exactly the same pattern," I interrupted. "Jessica creates a crisis through her own poor choices, then manipulates family members into solving it for her. When has she ever taken actual responsibility for fixing her own problems?" Mike sat down heavily on the couch. "She helped me when I was in college, though. Remember when I couldn't make rent that one semester?" This was the story Jessica always brought up, her trump card for guilting Mike. But I heard the real version from Mike's college roommate, David, at our wedding. "Mike, David told me what really happened that semester. You had the rent money, but Jessica borrowed it from you for some emergency and promised to pay it back before rent was due. When she didn't, you had to work double shifts at the restaurant to make up the difference. She didn't help you. She created the problem in the first place." Mike's face went pale as the memory came flooding back. "Oh my God, I'd completely forgotten about that. She made me feel like I owed her for bailing me out, but she was the reason I needed bailing out to begin with." "That's what she does, Mike. She creates problems, then positions herself as the solution, so you feel indebted to her forever. It's a pattern that's been going on for years." Over the next few days, I watched Mike start to see his sister's behavior with new clarity. He began remembering other incidents. How Jessica had helped plan their parents' anniversary party by spending twice the agreed budget and expecting Mike to cover the difference. How she volunteered him to help her move without asking him first. how she constantly brought up that one time she'd driven him to the hospital when he broke his ankle, conveniently forgetting that she'd caused the accident by insisting they take her car with the bald tires. But even as Mike started to see the pattern, I knew Jessica wouldn't give up easily. She'd spent decades perfecting her manipulation techniques, and our condo represented the biggest prize she'd ever gone after. Sure enough, the calls started the very next day. First, it was Jessica herself, crying about how hurt she was that Mike would choose his wife over his sister. When that didn't work, she sent Brad to call with a more reasonable proposal. Maybe they could just stay for a few months until Brad found a new job. When Mike held firm, Jessica escalated to using the children. 9-year-old Emma called Mike sobbing, asking why Uncle Mike didn't love them anymore, and why they had to live in their car. It was clearly a coached conversation, but it still broke Mike's heart. "She's using Emma as a weapon," I told Mike after he got off the phone, visibly shaken. "That's not normal family behavior. That's emotional abuse." The manipulation campaign continued for days. Jessica's mother-in-law called, having been fed a completely fictional version of events where we were heartlessly abandoning family in their hour of need. Mike's cousin, actually, called with concerns about family unity. Even the pastor from Jessica's church reached out, having been told that we were wealthy property owners refusing to help desperate relatives. Each call followed the same pattern. Jessica had painted herself as the innocent victim of circumstances beyond her control, while we were portrayed as selfish and greedy. She was remarkably skilled at crafting these narratives, always including just enough truth to make the lies believable. Mike started to crack under the pressure. "Maybe we could at least lend the money for a deposit on an apartment," he suggested one evening. "With what job is Brad going to pay rent?" I asked, "And based on Jessica's track record, do you really think we'd ever see that money again?" That's when I realized Jessica wasn't just trying to manipulate us into giving her a home. She was systematically trying to destroy our marriage. Every conversation, every guilt trip, every family obligation was designed to pit Mike against me. She positioned me as the obstacle between Mike and his family duties, hoping he'd eventually choose family loyalty over his wife. It was a sophisticated psychological warfare campaign, and I could see it was working. Mike was withdrawing from me, second-guessing every decision we'd made together, and starting to view our financial stability as somehow selfish or wrong. The breaking point came when Jessica showed up at Mike's workplace. She arrived during his lunch break, crying and dramatic, making a scene in front of his colleagues. She told everyone who would listen about how her brother had abandoned his family, how they were about to be homeless, and how all she needed was temporary shelter in the extra room he wasn't even using. Mike's coworkers, who didn't know the full story, started looking at him like he was some kind of monster. His boss, Mr. Peterson, even pulled him aside to suggest that family should come first, and that maybe Mike needed to reconsider his priorities. When Mike came home that night, he was defeated. "Maybe we should just let them stay for a month," he said quietly, "just until they get on their feet." That's when I decided I'd had enough of Jessica's manipulative bullying. I spent the next week doing research. I discovered some very interesting things about Jessica and Brad's financial situation. It turns out Brad hadn't just been laid off. He'd been fired for cause after being caught padding his expense reports. Jessica knew this, but had been telling everyone he was a victim of corporate downsizing. More importantly, I learned that Jessica had been telling people in their apartment complex that they owned property and would be moving out soon, which was why their landlord had started eviction proceedings for late rent. She'd been using the promise of our condo to buy herself time. But the most interesting discovery was about the house Jessica had inherited with Mike. Through public property records that anyone can access online, I discovered Jessica had taken out a home equity line of credit, HELOC, against the house 18 months ago for almost $60,000. She was behind on those payments, too. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. Jessica had also opened several credit cards in the months following Brad's firing, maxing them out on everything from luxury handbags to expensive dinners at upscale restaurants. While she was crying poverty to family members, she was simultaneously living a lifestyle that suggested she had plenty of money. I found social media posts from just 2 months earlier showing Jessica and Brad at an expensive resort in Florida, celebrating their wedding anniversary. The post talked about much-needed relaxation and featured pictures of them at spa treatments and fancy restaurants. This was supposedly during the worst of their financial crisis. Even more damning was a series of posts where Jessica bragged about her shopping hauls from high-end stores. Louis Vuitton purses, designer shoes, expensive jewelry, all purchased within the last 6 months while she was supposedly unable to make rent. I screenshotted everything and created a detailed timeline of Jessica's lies. The picture that emerged was of someone who was living beyond her means while systematically deceiving everyone around her about her true financial situation. But the most shocking discovery came when I contacted a friend who worked at the unemployment office. Jessica had been claiming that Brad was receiving unemployment benefits, but there was no record of him ever filing a claim. Either he wasn't eligible because of being fired for cause, or Jessica was lying about that too. I also learned that Jessica had been running a small side business from their apartment, some kind of online jewelry sales, but hadn't reported the income on any loan applications or to the IRS. She'd been depositing cash payments into a separate bank account that Brad apparently didn't know about. The web of lies was staggering. Jessica wasn't just stretching the truth or exaggerating their problems. She was engaged in systematic fraud on multiple fronts: tax evasion, mortgage fraud, loan fraud, and now she was attempting to commit what amounted to theft by deception against her own brother. I spent hours organizing all the evidence, creating a comprehensive file that detailed every lie, every fraudulent action, and every manipulation tactic Jessica had used. If she wanted to play hardball with our home and our marriage, I was going to show her exactly what hardball looked like. She'd chosen to wage psychological warfare against my marriage and try to steal our home through manipulation and fraud. Now she was going to learn what happened when you targeted someone who actually fought back. Armed with this information, I formulated my plan. The next Saturday, Jessica showed up at our door with Brad and the kids in tow, along with several boxes and suitcases. She waltzed in like she owned the place. "Okay," she announced. "We thought about it, and we're willing to let you stay in the master bedroom for now. Brad and I will take the office, and the kids can share the living room until we figure out a more permanent arrangement." I looked at Mike, who was standing there slack-jawed. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. "Actually, Jessica, before you get settled, there's something I need to tell you." She looked at me impatiently. "What now?" I walked over to her, smiled sweetly, and whispered in her ear, "I called your mortgage company about the equity line on your house. They're very interested in your current address change." The color drained from Jessica's face. "What are you talking about? You can't." "Actually, it's public record. Just like the fact that your landlord is evicting you, and that Brad was fired for embezzlement, not laid off." "That's not true," Jessica screamed, but I could see the panic in her eyes. "Oh, but it is. I also had an interesting conversation with your mortgage company. Apparently, lying about your primary residence is considered mortgage fraud. They're very interested in discussing your living situation." Jessica turned to Mike desperately. "Mike, you can't let her do this to me. I'm your sister." Mike, who had been listening to everything, looked at Jessica with a mixture of sadness and disgust. "You lied to me about Brad losing his job. You lied about living in the house. You tried to manipulate me into giving you our home based on lies. I needed help." Jessica wailed. "I was desperate." "Being desperate doesn't give you the right to commit fraud," I said calmly, "or to try to steal our home." Jessica spun toward me, her face red with rage. "You can't do this. It's not fair." I chuckled, the sound carrying no warmth whatsoever. "Oh, fairness wasn't your concern before, was it?" This is different. You're destroying my family. No, Jessica. Your choices destroyed your family. I'm just making sure you face the consequences. What happened next was a complete meltdown. Jessica screamed through accusations and threatened everything from lawsuits to physical violence. Brad tried to calm her down while simultaneously trying to figure out how much trouble they were actually in. The kids were crying, confused by their mother's hysteria. You have no idea what you've done. Jessica shrieked at me. You've destroyed my children's lives. They'll be homeless because of you. They'll be homeless because of your choices. Not mine, I replied calmly. You committed fraud, Jessica, multiple times. That's why you're in trouble. Not because I reported it. I never committed fraud. That house is my primary residence. Really? Because your utility bills show you've been living in this apartment for the past 2 years. Your children are enrolled in schools in this district, not the district where the house is located. Your voter registration, your car registration, your credit card statements, everything shows you've been living in the apartment. Jessica's face turned an even deeper shade of red. You have no right to investigate me like that. I had every right to protect my family from a criminal. I shot back. And yes, Jessica, mortgage fraud is a crime, a felony, actually. That's when Brad finally spoke up. Jessica, is this true? Did you lie about living in the house? Jessica whirled on her husband. Don't you dare take their side. We needed that money. Needed it for what? Brad demanded. You told me we needed the equity line to pay off your student loans. But if we're behind on payments, we needed it for important things. Jessica was becoming increasingly frantic as her lies unraveled in real time. I pulled out my phone and showed them some of the screenshots I'd collected. Important things like designer handbags, spa weekends, 5-star restaurants. Brad's face went white as he scrolled through the images. Jessica, we were supposed to be broke. You said we couldn't afford groceries, but you spent $800 on a purse last month. I deserve nice things after everything I've been through. Jessica screamed. I've been stressed and depressed, and retail therapy is the only thing that helps. Retail therapy with money you stole through fraud, I pointed out. Mike, who had been watching this entire exchange in stunned silence, finally found his voice. Jessica, you've been lying about everything. Your financial situation, Brad's job, where you live, what you spend money on. How can you expect us to help you when nothing you've told us is true? Because I'm your sister. Jessica wailed. Sisters don't abandon each other. Sisters also don't try to steal each other's homes through fraud and manipulation, Mike replied quietly. The revelation about Jessica's secret spending and lies was clearly news to Brad as well. As the reality of their situation sank in, he began asking more questions, and Jessica's answers became increasingly desperate and contradictory. Wait, Brad said, looking at another screenshot. You told me your sister lent you money for Emma's school supplies, but you bought these shoes the same day for $300. I needed shoes for a job interview. What job interview? You said you weren't looking for work because you needed to be available for the kids. There were potential opportunities. I watched their marriage implode in real time as Brad realized the extent of Jessica's deception. She hadn't just lied to us. She'd been systematically lying to him, too, apparently for months. How much money have you borrowed from your family? Brad asked quietly. Jessica's silence was telling. Jessica, how much money? It's not that much, she mumbled. I decided to help Brad understand exactly what his wife had been up to. According to my research, at least $4,000 from family members, not counting what she's asked from friends and neighbors. She's also got about $40,000 in credit card debt that you might not know about. Brad stared at his wife in shock. $40,000, Jessica? How is that possible? You lost your job. I had to keep us afloat somehow. By committing fraud and lying to everyone who cares about us. The fight between Jessica and Brad continued for another 20 minutes, with Jessica alternately trying to justify her actions and blame everyone else for her problems. She blamed me for being vindictive, Mike for being unsupportive, Brad for losing his job, the mortgage company for being unreasonable, and society in general for not understanding how hard her life was. What she never did was take actual responsibility for any of her choices. Finally, Mike stepped in. "Jessica, you need to leave now." But Mike, no. "You tried to steal our home. You lied about everything. You brought your children here, planning to force us out of our own place. I'm done." It took another hour of drama, but eventually they left. Jessica was still screaming threats as Brad loaded their stuff back into their car. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The mortgage company launched an investigation into Jessica's HELOC the following Monday. Since she couldn't prove she was actually living in the house and had been missing payments, they called the full amount due immediately. Her landlord completed the eviction process by Wednesday. Jessica, Brad, and the kids ended up staying in a motel while Brad's parents decided whether to let them crash in their basement. The house Jessica had inherited, the one she'd been so proud of buying Mike out of, went into foreclosure within 2 weeks. She lost everything. The legal consequences were swift and severe. The mortgage fraud investigation led to criminal charges being filed against Jessica. Because the amount involved was over $50,000, it qualified as a felony with potential prison time. Jessica tried to hire a lawyer, but couldn't afford one. With her finances in ruins, the public defender assigned to her case quickly realized that the evidence against her was overwhelming and recommended she take a plea deal. The plea agreement required Jessica to make full restitution to the mortgage company, which was impossible given her financial situation. She was sentenced to 2 years of probation, community service, and ordered to attend financial counseling and therapy for compulsive spending. The criminal conviction made it nearly impossible for Jessica and Brad to find decent housing. Most landlords run background checks, and a felony fraud conviction is an automatic disqualifier. They ended up having to rent a rundown trailer in a questionable neighborhood, paying twice the normal rate because the landlord specialized in renting to people with criminal records. But the financial consequences were just the beginning of Jessica's problems. The investigation into her mortgage fraud had uncovered her unreported income from the jewelry business, which triggered an audit from the IRS. She owed thousands in back taxes and penalties, money she obviously didn't have. The IRS garnished her wages from the retail job she'd finally been forced to take, leaving the family with barely enough to survive. Brad was working 2 part-time jobs, but his association with Jessica's criminal activity made it difficult for him to find steady full-time employment. The stress destroyed what was left of their marriage. Brad had initially tried to stand by Jessica, believing her claims that she'd only been trying to help their family. But as the full extent of her deception became clear, he realized he'd been married to a stranger. The breaking point came when Brad discovered that Jessica had forged his signature on several of the credit card applications. Not only had she committed fraud against financial institutions, she'd also committed identity theft against her own husband. "I was trying to protect you," Jessica insisted when confronted with copies of the forged documents. "If the applications were in your name, too, it would hurt your credit." "You forged my signature, Jessica. You committed identity theft against me, your own husband. How is that protecting me?" "I didn't have a choice. We needed the money. We needed the money because you were spending thousands of dollars on designer clothes and spa treatments while telling me we were broke." The divorce proceedings were brutal. Brad filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, but also requested that Jessica be held responsible for all the fraudulent debts since she'd hidden them from him. He had documentation showing that he'd been unaware of most of Jessica's spending and borrowing. Jessica tried to claim that Brad was abandoning his family in their darkest hour, but the evidence of her systematic deception was too overwhelming. Even Jessica's own mother testified that she was concerned about her daughter's relationship with truth and money. Brad managed to find a better job, but it paid 30% less than his old one, and they had to move 3 states away to take it. Before they left, Jessica made one final attempt at reconciliation, calling Mike to apologize and ask for financial help with the moving costs. Mike's response was simple. "You made your choices, Jessica. Live with them." The family fallout was intense, but relatively short-lived. A few relatives initially took Jessica's side, believing her version of events where we had heartlessly destroyed her life. But when the truth about Brad's firing and the mortgage fraud came out, support dried up quickly. Jessica's mother-in-law, who had initially offered them her basement, rescinded the offer when she learned about the fraud. "I can't have criminals living in my house," she told Brad over the phone while Jessica listened on speaker. Mike's aunts and uncles, who had known Jessica since she was born, were disgusted by her behavior. Uncle Robert, who had always been Jessica's favorite, called Mike to apologize for not seeing through her manipulation sooner. "I always knew Jessica had entitlement issues," he said, "but I never imagined she'd commit fraud and try to steal your home." The extended family gradually learned the full scope of Jessica's lies. She'd been borrowing small amounts of money from various relatives for months, always with some sob story about temporary hardship. Nobody realized others were also lending money until people started comparing notes at a cousin's wedding. Aunt Margaret had lent her $800 for car repairs. Uncle David had given her $500 for Emma's school supplies. Cousin Lisa had covered $600 for emergency medical bills. In total, Jessica had scammed nearly $4,000 from family members. The revelation completed Jessica's social exile from the family. The final nail in the coffin was when Grandma Helen, the family matriarch who had always doted on Jessica, called to tell her she was disappointed and ashamed and wouldn't be sending birthday gifts to the grandchildren anymore. Meanwhile, Mike and I settled into our newly mortgage-free life. The experience had been traumatic, but it also brought us closer together. Mike finally saw his sister for who she really was, and I gained a new appreciation for how important it is to protect what you've worked for. We used some of the money we would have been spending on mortgage payments to take a delayed honeymoon to Italy. While we were there, sipping wine in Tuscany, Mike got a text from Brad. "Jessica wants to know if you'll co-sign on an apartment lease for us. The bankruptcy attorney says we need someone with good credit." Mike showed me the message. I raised an eyebrow. What should I tell him? Mike asked. I pretended to consider it seriously. Tell him that fairness wasn't our concern before, so why should it be now? Mike laughed and typed back, "No." The best part of this whole story happened 6 months later. Brad had found a decent job, and they'd managed to rent a small apartment in their new city. Jessica had been forced to take a part-time job at a retail store, something she considered beneath her. I was browsing Facebook when I saw a post from Jessica on a local community page in her new town. She was asking if anyone knew of available rentals because their landlord was raising their rent and they couldn't afford the increase. The comments were brutal. Multiple people had looked up Jessica's background after her previous posts complaining about unfair treatment from landlords and employers. Someone had found the public records of her mortgage fraud case. "Isn't this the same Jessica Morrison who committed mortgage fraud in our old city?" one comment read. "She tried to scam my church for rent money last month," another added. Said she was a single mother whose husband died in Afghanistan, but I looked it up and her husband works at the tire shop downtown. The thread devolved into a public discussion of Jessica's various lies and scams. By the end, she deleted the post, but screenshots were already circulating in local Facebook groups. The lesson here, I suppose, is that entitlement and fraud have consequences. Jessica spent years believing she deserved whatever she wanted, regardless of who she had to hurt to get it. She was so convinced of her own victimhood that she couldn't see how her actions affected others. When she tried to steal our home, she probably thought she was just being clever, finding a way to solve her problems at our expense. She never considered that her lies would catch up to her, or that her victims might fight back. Mike still feels guilty sometimes about not helping his sister when she was struggling. But I remind him that there's a difference between helping family and enabling fraud. Jessica didn't want help. She wanted us to solve her problems by sacrificing our own security. The other family members who had been scammed eventually realized they'd been manipulated. Uncle Robert started a group text with everyone Jessica had borrowed money from, and they discovered her systematic approach to the con. She told each person they were the only one she was asking, that she was embarrassed to need help, and that she'd pay them back as soon as Brad's severance pay came through. None of them ever got their money back. Jessica and Brad's bankruptcy wiped out most of their debts, including the family loans. As for Mike and me, we're doing better than ever. We've started a small investment portfolio with the money we're not spending on mortgage payments. We're talking about having kids in the next couple of years, and we're grateful we won't be raising them around Jessica's toxic influence. I recently heard through the family grapevine that Jessica is still struggling. Brad's job isn't stable, and they've moved twice more due to various landlord disputes. Jessica has been banned from several local churches for trying to scam their benevolence funds with false sob stories. The kids are doing okay, thankfully. They're staying with Brad's parents during the week so they can remain in the same school district while Jessica and Brad live in a studio apartment across town. It's a sad situation for Emma and Jake, but at least they have some stability. Mike's relationship with his sister is probably irreparable. She's reached out a few times, always when she needs something, but never with a genuine apology. Her last message was asking if we could lend them money for Christmas presents for the kids. Mike didn't respond. I know some people might think my revenge was too harsh. After all, Jessica does have children, and they're innocent victims in this situation. But I refuse to feel guilty for protecting our home and our future. Jessica made a series of deliberate choices, committing fraud, lying to family, trying to manipulate us out of our home. The consequences of those choices aren't my responsibility. The truth is, if I hadn't acted when I did, Jessica would have continued escalating. She was already spreading lies about owning our condo to strangers in her apartment complex. Who knows what other fraudulent schemes she might have attempted using our property as collateral. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I just let her move in temporarily, as Mike initially suggested. Would she ever have left? Would we have ended up losing our home to her anyway? I think I know the answer, and it's part of why I sleep peacefully at night. The final update to this saga came just last month. Jessica called Mike crying to tell him that she and Brad were getting divorced. Apparently, the stress of their financial situation and Brad's resentment over losing his career due to Jessica's own poor choices had destroyed their marriage. But there was more to the story than Jessica initially let on. Through Brad's lawyer, we learned that Jessica had continued her pattern of deception even after the criminal conviction. She'd been caught running small-scale scams in their new town, including attempting to sell fake jewelry online and creating sob stories to collect money from local charity organizations. The final straw for Brad came when Jessica tried to claim that one of her children had a serious medical condition requiring expensive treatment. She'd created fake medical documents and was soliciting donations from their new church congregation. When Brad discovered what she was doing, he realized that his wife was not just a desperate woman who had made poor choices. She was a compulsive liar and con artist who would never change. She tried to use our children as props in her scams, Brad told Mike during one painful phone conversation. She was coaching Emma to cry on command when meeting with potential donors. I can't expose my kids to that anymore. The custody battle was complicated by Jessica's criminal record and continued fraudulent behavior. Brad was awarded primary custody, with Jessica getting supervised visitation only. The judge noted in his ruling that Jessica's pattern of deception and manipulation made her a potential danger to the children's emotional well-being. "I need to come home," she sobbed into the phone. I need family." Mike listened patiently. Then he said, "Jessica, You destroyed your relationship with this family when you tried to steal our home. You can't come back from that. But I'm your sister. Sisters don't commit fraud against each other. Sisters don't try to manipulate each other out of their homes. You stopped being my sister the day you walked into our kitchen and demanded we give you our life. After Mike hung up, he sat quietly for a long time. I could tell he was sad about how things had ended, despite everything Jessica had done. "Do you think I'm being too harsh?" he asked. I took his hand and squeezed it. "You're protecting your real family now. That's what husbands do." And that's exactly what he did. We're building a life based on honesty, hard work, and mutual respect. Jessica could have been part of that, but she chose entitlement and fraud instead. Looking back on this whole experience, I learned that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones most willing to destroy your life for their own benefit. Jessica spent years building a relationship with Mike based on manipulation and guilt, positioning herself as the victim who deserved his constant support. When we wouldn't enable her anymore, when we refused to be her latest victims, she revealed who she really was. The mask came off completely, and underneath was someone willing to destroy her brother's happiness to solve her own problems. I also learned that standing up to bullies and manipulators is essential, even when they're family. Especially when they're family. The people closest to us often have the most power to hurt us, and the greatest expectation that we will allow it. Jessica is still out there somewhere, probably looking for new victims to manipulate and new schemes to try. But she's not our problem anymore. Mike and I have each other, our beautiful home, and a future built on truth instead of lies. And every time I walk into our living room and look around at our mortgage-free condo, I smile and think, fairness wasn't your concern before, was it, Jessica? But it sure is now. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with a manipulative family member, even if it meant risking everything? What was your moment of truth? Tell me what you think in the comments below. I really want to know.